I spent 38 years working as a family court paralegal in Ottawa, and in that time I learned one thing. Above everything else, the most dangerous situations are never the ones that look dangerous at first. They look like love. My daughter met him at a conference in Toronto. She was 31, working as a project coordinator for a nonprofit, and she called me that same evening, her voice lighter than I had heard it in years. She said he was thoughtful. She said he asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. She said he made her laugh without trying. I was glad for her. She had been careful with her heart since her last relationship ended badly, and I had watched her rebuild herself slowly, quietly, the way she always did things. So when she told me about him, I felt something loosen in my chest. I thought, finally. His name was Conrad. He was 41, an architectural consultant based in Vancouver who traveled frequently for work. He had dark eyes and a very straight back, and he shook my hand the first time we met with both of his hands, the way some men do when they want you to know they were raised right. We had dinner at a restaurant on Elgin Street, the four of us, my daughter Conrad, my husband George, and me. Conrad ordered wine knowledgeably, asked George about his years working in municipal planning, and told me my daughter had inherited her precision from someone because he could tell it didn't come from nowhere. I remember thinking he was polished. Too polished, maybe, the way a floor is too polished. You can see yourself in it, but you're also at risk of slipping. But I told myself I was being a suspicious old woman. My daughter was happy. That was what mattered. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. She called me from Vancouver, where she had gone to visit him for the long weekend, and she was crying in that particular way she has when she is overwhelmed by something good. Short breaths, trying to compose herself, laughing at herself for crying. He had proposed at home, she said, not at a restaurant, not somewhere dramatic. He had cooked dinner, and when she came into the kitchen, there was a ring on the edge of her wine glass. I thought that was genuinely romantic, simple and considered and personal. The wedding was in June the following year at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. 200 guests. My daughter wore her grandmother's earrings and wrote her own vows, and she looked so entirely herself standing up there that I had to press my thumbnail into my palm to keep from crying through the whole ceremony. Conrad's mother, Sylvia, sat in the front row on the groom's side in a cream blazer and a hat that was slightly too formal for the occasion. She kissed my daughter on both cheeks during the reception and said, loud enough for the table to hear, that she had always imagined Conrad with someone more low-key, but she supposed this would do. My daughter laughed it off. I filed it away. The first year was fine as far as I could tell. My daughter and Conrad settled into a condo in the Plateau area of Montreal. Conrad had taken a long-term contract there, and my daughter had found remote work she could do from anywhere. I visited twice, and both times the apartment was neat and pleasant, and my daughter seemed well, if slightly quieter than usual. I told myself it was adjustment. Marriage is an adjustment. Living with someone full-time, in a new city, away from your established routines. That is not nothing. I told myself I was projecting because I had seen too many files in too many years, and I needed to let my daughter live her life without my professional anxieties following her around. But mothers notice things. She stopped sending me photographs the way she used to. Before, she would text me small things. A funny sign she passed on the street, a meal she was proud of, a view from a window. That stopped somewhere in the middle of the first year, and when I mentioned it lightly, she said she had just been busy and changed the subject. She started calling me from her office instead of from home. When I asked her opinion on things, small things, family things, what she thought we should do for George's retirement dinner, she would pause longer than necessary and say something like, I don't know. Whatever you think is best. My daughter had never said whatever you think is best in her life. She had opinions about everything. She had always had opinions about everything. That was one of my favorite things about her. I drove to Montreal in October of the second year unannounced. I know that sounds like an intrusion. I had my reasons. She had sounded flat on the phone for weeks, and when I asked her if she was all right, she said she was just tired, and I knew my daughter's tired voice, and this was not it. Conrad was away. She opened the door and looked startled, and then something in her face settled, and she stepped back to let me in without saying anything. The apartment was very tidy, perfectly tidy in the way that suggests someone has been careful rather than comfortable. I noticed there were no personal items on the shelves that had been there during my previous visit a year earlier. No new books, no photographs from the wedding or their travels, nothing that indicated that a woman who had a whole personality was living here. I asked her where her things were. She said she was a minimalist now. We sat at the kitchen table and I made tea and I asked her carefully if she was happy. She said yes. I asked her if she felt like herself. She was quiet for a long time before she said that she thought she was still getting used to things. I asked her what things. She looked at the table. She said Conrad had strong preferences about the home environment, that he found clutter distracting, that he worked under a great deal of pressure and needed the space to be calm when he returned. She said this the way people recite things they have been told many times, in someone else's cadence, with someone else's reasoning. I recognized that particular recitation. I had heard it in my office for decades. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. George asked me how she was. I said she was fine, because I didn't have anything concrete yet, because my daughter had told me she was fine, because I understood, more than most people, how these things work, how the woman in the room will protect the situation even from her own mother, especially from her own mother, because she has been made to believe that saying it out loud will make it real. So I waited, and I paid attention. Over the following months, I noticed the pattern of what was permitted to reach me. Phone calls, yes, but shorter. Visits, yes, but Conrad was always home. Christmas was held at Sylvia's house in West Vancouver for the first time, and when I raised an eyebrow, my daughter said it made sense because Conrad's family was larger and the house was bigger, and I said, of course, and I booked flights, and I went. Sylvia's house was large and cold in the way that expensive things sometimes are. She greeted us at the door, kissed George on the cheek, gave me a nod that acknowledged my existence without welcoming it, and immediately guided my daughter away to help with something in the kitchen while Conrad gave us a brief tour. Dinner was on Christmas Eve. 12 people around a long table, 2 of Conrad's brothers and their wives, Sylvia at the head, my daughter at the far end near the kitchen. George and I were seated in the middle, which I recognized almost with admiration as a very effective arrangement, central enough to seem included, far enough from our daughter to make sustained conversation difficult. My daughter had cooked half the meal. She told me this quietly before we sat down, with something in her voice that wanted me to notice and also did not want to make a thing of it. She had made the potatoes and the green beans and the gravy and the pie. Sylvia had made the roast. Halfway through dinner, Conrad reached over and picked up my daughter's fork from beside her plate. He studied the tines for a moment, then he set it down without using it and said quietly but in the silence between conversations that the silverware still looked cloudy and that he had mentioned this before. My daughter's face went very still. She said she was sorry. Sylvia looked at her son with an expression I can only describe as approval. She said something about how a well-run household was a reflection of respect. She said it pleasantly, as one might say something true and obvious, something that did not require a response. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. George put his hand on my knee under the table. The conversation resumed. Conrad poured more wine. My daughter ate her meal and said very little for the remainder of the evening. At one point, one of Conrad's sisters-in-law asked her something about her work, and she started to answer. And Conrad said, without looking up from his plate, that it was really more of a hobby than a career at this point, and my daughter stopped talking mid-sentence. I excused myself after dessert. I stood in the hallway outside the bathroom and breathed steadily for a while, the way I have learned to breathe when I am managing what I feel so that I can still think clearly. I took stock of what I had seen, not what I suspected, what I had seen. When I came back to the table, I sat down and I finished my wine, and I talked to Conrad's brother about his work in Kelowna, and I smiled at everything that required smiling at. And in my head, I made a plan. I have a friend I've known since law school. She did not become a paralegal. She became a family lawyer, and then a crown prosecutor, and then a victim's advocate, and she has spent the last 15 years working specifically with cases of coercive control. Her name is not important for this story. What is important is that she knows more about what psychological abuse looks like from the inside than almost anyone I have ever met, and she owes me a favor from 1987 that she has always said she would repay when I needed it. I called her on Boxing Day from a walk. I told her what I had seen. She asked me specific questions, the kind that come from years of knowing which details matter. She did not tell me I was overreacting. She did not tell me to wait and see. She told me what to start documenting. Over the next 8 months, I documented. I kept a notebook, a paper one, because I have learned that paper does not sync to shared cloud accounts. I wrote down dates, times, specific words. I noted when my daughter's voice changed on the phone. I noted when plans we had made were canceled at the last minute and the reason given changed between tellings. I noted the way Conrad spoke about my daughter in the handful of group settings where I observed them together. The offhand corrections, the small deflations, the way he could compliment her in a sentence that somehow left her smaller than before he had spoken. My daughter did not tell me anything directly. I did not ask her to. I understood that asking directly would only cause her to defend him, which would cause her to have to believe her own defense more firmly, and I had no interest in pushing her further in. Instead, I called her every few days. I kept the calls easy and warm and light. I told her about the neighbors and George's bad knee in the garden. I asked about Montreal, restaurants, weather, small things. I did not ask about Conrad unless she raised him first. I was building something, and the foundation of it was her trust, and her trust required her to feel that I was simply her mother who missed her, which was also entirely true. In the spring, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon and she was crying. Not the overwhelmed with something good crying, the other kind. She didn't explain right away. She said she had a bad day. I let her talk. She talked around the edges of it for a while. She mentioned that she and Conrad had disagreed about something, that the conversation had gotten difficult, that she had felt very alone afterward. I listened. I did not fill the silence with solutions. When she ran out of words, I said, "I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm always here." She said she knew. She said that helped. 2 weeks later, she called again. This time, she told me a little more. She said Conrad monitored their joint account in a way that made her uncomfortable, that if she made a purchase he considered unnecessary, there would be a conversation about it that left her feeling ashamed. She still had her own account, technically, but her salary was low from the remote contract work, and there was an unspoken expectation that large expenditures came from the joint account, and the joint account required agreement, and agreement required not disagreeing. I wrote that down. I also, at this point, spoke quietly to their family physician, not to disclose specifics. I was careful about that, but I asked questions in my professional capacity about the process of documenting a pattern in a medical file and what a patient might do if they needed a confidential record to exist. I was building from multiple directions. The moment I had been preparing for, though I did not know it would take the specific shape it took, came in September. My daughter's birthday was the 19th. She was turning 35. I had asked, months in advance if George and I could come to Montreal to take her to dinner. And she had said yes, and Conrad had said yes, and we had made a reservation at a restaurant she had always wanted to try, a small French place in the old port that required booking weeks ahead. On the 17th, Conrad's mother called to say she would be in Montreal and would join us. I said that was fine. The dinner was a Friday evening. Sylvia arrived at the restaurant before we did, which I suspected was intentional. She had already spoken to the host about seating, and we were moved from the table my daughter had specifically requested, a quiet corner, to a round table in the center of the room, which Sylvia said was more convivial. My daughter said nothing. She smiled at the new table and sat down. The evening started pleasantly enough. Wine was ordered. There was bread, which was good. My daughter talked about a project she was working on, a grant she was hoping to secure, something she was genuinely excited about. She was animated. She was herself for a few minutes, the self I had been waiting to see. Conrad let her finish. Then he said, with the tone of someone being helpful, that she should probably be realistic about the timeline, given that she tended to overcommit. She stopped talking. Sylvia smiled at her son. I watched my daughter look down at the bread on her plate. I watched her fold whatever she had been feeling back into herself, the way you fold a letter before putting it away. She had done this so many times by now that she did it without expression. That was the part that frightened me most. Not that it hurt her, that it no longer visibly hurt her, that she had learned to absorb it the way lungs absorb air, automatically, without choice. George's hand found mine under the table. The main courses arrived. Conversation continued. Sylvia talked at length about renovations to her house in Vancouver. Conrad talked about a project in Winnipeg. My daughter ate. I ate. I said the appropriate things at the appropriate times. And then Conrad looked at my daughter's glass and said, in the particular quiet voice he used for these observations, that she had had enough wine for the evening. She put the glass down. She did it immediately, without discussion, without looking at him, without looking at us to see if we had noticed. She simply put it down, and I understood in that moment that this was not something new. This was a reflex. This was a reflex that had been installed slowly and methodically over 4 years. I excused myself from the table. I went to the front of the restaurant and I stood near the host's station and I made a call. I called my friend. She picked up on the second ring because I had texted her an hour earlier to say that this dinner was happening and that I might need her before it was over. I told her what I had just watched, all of it. The table relocation, the interruption, the glass. She said 3 words, "Do you have everything?" I said yes. She said, "Call the number I sent you and use my name." I went back to the table. I had dessert. I was warm and easy, and I told a story about something that had happened at the community center that made everyone laugh, including my daughter, who for a moment looked like herself again. When we said goodnight on the street, I held her for a long moment. She gripped me back harder than she needed to. I drove to the hotel George and I were staying at. I sat at the small desk and I opened my notebook and I called the number. The woman I reached was a legal advocate at a family law clinic that my friend had been connected to for years, one that operated a specific intake process for coercive control cases, which, since the 2023 amendments to the Divorce Act, had been explicitly recognized in Canadian family law. I had known this. I had been building toward this. I explained who I was and who my friend was, and I described the situation carefully. The advocate listened. She asked questions. She told me what the next steps could look like, not what they would look like, because that depended on my daughter, and my daughter would have to want this. She asked me if I thought my daughter was safe right now. I thought about the glass being set down, the reflex of it. I said for tonight, yes, but I want to move quickly. I went home to Ottawa the following morning. On Sunday, I drove back to Montreal alone. I told my daughter I had left my reading glasses at the restaurant and wanted to check, and then we could have lunch. Just the two of us. Conrad was away. I had known this. I had checked the timing carefully. We sat in her kitchen, and I put my notebook on the table. I said, I need to tell you what I've seen, not what I feel, and not what I think you should do, just what I've seen. She looked at the notebook. She looked at me. She said, Mom. I said, I know. We sat there for a long time. I did not push. I did not list. I simply told her in plain language that what I had observed over 4 years was a pattern that had a name, that the name was coercive control, that it was recognized under Canadian law, and that there were people, not me, professionals, who could help her understand her options without anyone making any decisions on her behalf. She cried, not the composing kind, the other kind, the kind that comes from a long time of not being able to. She said she had been so ashamed. She said she didn't know how it had happened. She said she had tried so many times to figure out the moment it began and she couldn't find it. I told her that was one of the defining features of what she had lived through, that it doesn't begin in a single moment, that it's built so gradually, so carefully, that by the time you can see the structure of it, you're already inside. She said, I used to be someone with opinions. I said, you still are. That hasn't gone anywhere. She met with the advocate 2 weeks later. She did this on her own. I did not accompany her. She asked me not to, and I respected that, because this was hers to do in the way she needed to do it. She called me afterward and she said the advocate had explained the process clearly and that she understood her options. Over the following 3 months with the advocate and a family lawyer, my daughter built her case. She had, it turned out, kept records of her own. Screenshots saved to a personal account he didn't know about, a journal she kept at her office, emails and texts that documented the financial control. She had been building something too, quietly, without telling me, because she was her mother's daughter and she had learned in 34 years that you document what matters. Conrad did not anticipate any of this. Sylvia, I am told, was blindsided. She called me once in November and said that I had destroyed her family. I told her that her family had done that work themselves. The divorce was finalized the following June. The coercive control documentation was formally recorded in the proceedings. My daughter's lawyer was exceptional. Conrad tried twice to reframe the narrative through counterfilings, and both times the paper trail made it straightforward. My daughter moved back to Ottawa in the spring to an apartment in Westboro with large windows and a balcony that looks over a row of silver maples. She filled it slowly, a few plants, some books, a print she bought herself at a market on a Saturday morning when she walked by it and wanted it and simply bought it. She called me from a farmer's market in August and texted me a photo of a ridiculous, enormous squash she found funny, just because she found it funny, just because she wanted to tell me. I saved it. I still look at it sometimes. She runs in the mornings now, down along the river path. She's back at work. She finds meaningful, rebuilding a professional network that contracted during those years without her fully noticing. She is learning, she told me, how to want things again without calculating whether the wanting will cost her. I think about the years I spent in my office reading files about other people's daughters. The number of times I believed the outcome depended on having the right judge, the right timing, the right argument. And those things matter. They do. But I have learned that what matters first is someone in the room who sees clearly and stays steady and refuses to look away. Someone who is not so afraid of being wrong that they do nothing while they wait to be sure. I was not always sure. I was sure enough. That is what mothers are for. I keep thinking about the moment my daughter put that wine glass down. Not because someone spilled it, not because she was finished, because she had been told to, and she did it without flinching, without looking at me, without any expression at all. And that absence of expression was the thing that broke my heart most completely, because I remembered a girl who had opinions about everything, who once argued with her father for 40 minutes about the best route to Algonquin Park, who laughed loudly in restaurants and never once apologized for it. What Conrad built wasn't built in a day. That's the thing people don't understand when they hear a story like this from the outside. They want to know why she didn't leave sooner, why she didn't say something, why she smiled through dinners, while Sylvia made quiet, cutting remarks and Conrad corrected her in front of guests. The answer is that it didn't feel like a prison being constructed. It felt like compromise. It felt like consideration. It felt, at the beginning, like love. He was careful. People who do what he did are almost always careful. The control comes wrapped in concern, in practicality, in the language of partnership. The joint account wasn't controlling, it was efficient. The comments about her work weren't dismissive. He was being realistic, keeping her expectations manageable. By the time the structure was fully built, she was living inside it and had forgotten what the outside felt like. What I know, after 38 years sitting beside cases like hers, is that outcomes don't happen by accident. Conrad behaved the way he did because he had learned, somewhere early in his life, that he could, and that the consequences would be manageable. Sylvia reinforced it. The system around them permitted it until it didn't. My daughter survived it because she had, somewhere underneath all of it, kept a private account, a private journal, a private record of what was real. She hadn't stopped knowing the truth. She had just been made to doubt whether the truth entitled her to anything. That quiet persistence, the part of her that kept documenting, kept the screenshots, kept writing things down in a notebook at her office, that came from something in her that could not be entirely extinguished. I think of that as the most important thing a person can carry. Not the loudest voice, not the strongest argument, but the steady, unglamorous refusal to stop seeing clearly. That is a kind of integrity that no one can install in you and no one can fully take away. I was not a perfect mother in this. I made mistakes. I waited longer than I should have in certain moments. I chose gentleness when I might have chosen directness. I second-guessed myself because I was afraid of pushing her further in. What I did right, I think, was stay close without making her feel watched, and trust that the foundation we had built across 34 years was strong enough to hold when she finally needed to stand on it. My daughter is rebuilding now, slowly and on her own terms, which is the only way it counts. She is learning to want things again without calculating the cost in advance. That takes longer than people expect, but I see it happening in the photo of a ridiculous squash texted for no reason except that it made her laugh, in the plants she chose herself for her balcony, in the morning runs along the river that belong entirely to her. She came back to herself, not the self she was before. That woman is gone, and I don't think she'd want her back exactly. The self she is becoming has lived through something, understands something, carries something that has weight and use. That is not nothing. That is, if I'm honest, something close to everything.